I'm the UN Resident Coordinator for Thailand. That means that I'm responsible for making sure all the different UN agencies, and I think you've seen some of them outside, the different stands. You've probably realized now that the UN is a very complicated organization. We've got lots of bits and pieces and different organizations. So my job is to ensure that we all, as the UN, work together and collaborate in delivering on what is expected of us. My second job is being the head of the UNDP program here in Thailand. UNDP is, as you know, one of the UN agencies here. So I do both jobs. Unfortunately, I only get one salary, but I do both jobs. So it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I was here this morning. I was very impressed by the number of people, by the energy, the vitality in the room. It's just amazing. I know you're starting off. I'd like to thank Mr. Solomon, who, as the lead organizer of this incredible event, for allowing us to come and spend some time with you. For myself, I've actually just arrived in Thailand. This is my 4th week taking up my new position. Previous to this, I spent the last 4 years at our headquarters in New York, and I had the privilege of working in the office of the UN Secretary General. So that was a great way of getting a really good overview of everything the UN does and how we work with member states. Because at the end of the day, the UN is an organization of member states. But apart from my 4 years in that very glamorous position at the top of the UN Secretariat in New York, if you've ever seen the building, I've spent all of my career working in the field. A lot of it in this region. I sometimes get lost myself in the number of countries, and if I give you the number of countries, you'll probably start to work out what age I must be. But among the countries I've worked in this region have been India, Bhutan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, East Timor, and North Korea. I've also worked in the Middle East, in Oman and in Iraq, just after the first war, and I've worked in Africa, in Kenya and in Rwanda. So it's one of the advantages of working for the UN. You can see it's a really incredible privilege to work in so many countries, meet with so many people, and feel that in our own little way, we're doing something to contribute. And during my career, different countries, working with different people, I've seen how the power of youth can be harnessed to achieve incredible development and humanitarian results. You may know that the previous UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, introduced in 2013 the position of a UN Youth Envoy. Now, the current UN Youth Envoy, the second person to hold that position, was just appointed in June by the Secretary General. She's a young woman from Sri Lanka, and I'm not very good at pronouncing Sri Lankan names, despite the fact I spent some time there, but her name is Jaya Wickremyaka. She's just 27 years old, so that actually makes her the youngest senior official in the United Nations. The role of the Youth Envoy is to ensure young people's participation, to ensure that perspectives are reflected across the pillars of the United Nations work, and to make sure that young people are given the voice and opportunity to contribute. I think we know that ignoring the power of youth, it's not just a missed opportunity, but it's also a violation of your rights to voice and participation. And that voice and participation is now more important than ever. the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. You'll hear all of us UN people talk about the Sustainable Development Goals because it is now core to what we do. It's our framework, it's our mission, it's our mandate. And these goals cannot be achieved without your support, your participation. Thankfully, we see that more and more governments are identifying youth as a priority, and more young people are breaking new grounds, promoting poverty eradication, peace and justice, proposing innovative solutions, and launching effective grassroots campaigns. It's really young people are in the lead on these activities. Nobody does it as well or as creatively as you do. You may know that every year in September, all the member states of the United Nations meet in New York, the beginning of each General Assembly. We have, in that third week of September, practically every president, every head of state is present in New York, leading their country's delegation. For quite a while now, the UN has encouraged the member states. They bring their senior officials, Minister of Foreign Affairs, the ambassadors. But the UN has encouraged countries to also bring, as part of their official delegation, youth representatives. Now, countries can do that in different ways. Thailand, I was just at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Thursday, are just choosing their youth representatives. And they've been bringing youth representatives as part of their delegation to the General Assembly in New York for the last 10 years. Something you might want to look at when you go home, see what your governments do. It's a great opportunity. Different member states do it differently. There may be an open call for proposal. But I think it really also shows that the UN itself is serious about hearing the voice of young people. I want to just touch again, as I was talking about, the Sustainable Development Goals and give you a little bit of the background. I was actually in New York at the time when all of these were being discussed and negotiated, and it was really quite a process. When you think that every member state of the United Nations had to agree on every word that's in the 2030 Agenda, every goal, and we have 17 goals, but if you look a bit closer, there's 169 targets, and then I won't even go into the indicators and statistics that go along with it. It wasn't a document that was drawn up by bureaucrats, people like me. It was drawn up by the member states themselves. One of the things we did in the UN, particularly in UNDP, was we also wanted to bring more voices into the discussion. So it wasn't just the official representatives of the country. And we organized, with our UN partners, national consultations, 100 national consultations, 16 or so global consultations, and also really interesting, and I don't know if any of you participated, online survey called My World, asking people what were their priorities for the Sustainable Development Goals. That survey got 10 million people contributing their voices. This then fed into the process of developing the Sustainable Development Goals. So they belong to everyone. They were developed, we think, in the most comprehensive and consultative manner that we as the world have ever come up with a document, with an agenda. So the SDGs are a call to action. Now you will possibly recall that we used to have something called the Millennium Development Goals, which had set 2015 as their target. The Millennium Development Goals were extremely useful. In fact, it's because we saw how useful they were that there was then the decision to continue with the Sustainable Development Goals. However, it has to be recognized they were limited to 8 goals. They focused mostly on social sector, on issues that are important: health, education, women's rights. They didn't perhaps fully address climate change. They didn't address perhaps economic growth, which is necessary to achieve many of the goals. They didn't perhaps really address fully issues of governance. How do we make decisions? How are people involved? So it's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and there was some debate about, can we really have 17? Isn't it too many? And then isn't it a weird number, 17? People thought 15, that's a nicer number. But there was really an attempt in these goals to encompass everything. It's really a work plan for the planet. And I say the planet because it's about the people who live on the planet, but it's also about where we live and how we can sustain our planet. The other difference is the Millennium Development Goals were a little bit in the old paradigm of development. You know, if we go back to even, say, the 60s, you know, development was about rich countries giving money to poor countries. We've long gone past that. It's now a global partnership. The Sustainable Development Goals apply to every country. It doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor. These are goals that are relevant to every country. Many countries in Europe, in the European Union, in my region of the world, have already introduced in their own national plans the Sustainable Development Goals. It applies to everyone. It also recognizes it's not just about governments. It's not about what your government does. It's about private sector. It's about citizens. It's about local governments. So it's a much more comprehensive approach to I think, more than development, as I said, almost like a work plan for the planet. They're all interconnected, and that was another thing. Although there's 17 goals, it's recognized that if you make progress in one, it's going to impact on the other, or vice versa. If you're falling behind in some, it's not going to help on achieving the other goals. So we're trying to convene regional consultations on youth, peace and security, and look at perhaps doing a study and presenting some of our results to the UN Security Council. Economic empowerment. So we're working with one of our sister UN agencies, the International Labour Organization, to take forward what is an existing global initiative on decent jobs for youth. And the stress here is not on jobs for youth, but decent jobs. So we've looked at youth employment strategies in countries like Equatorial Guinea, Côte d'Ivoire, working with governments, private sectors and universities here in Thailand to build entrepreneurial skills, promote social innovation, and addressing the skills gap between the education young people are receiving and what the labour market needs. And then we're also looking at the implementation and monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals. How can we be accountable? How can young people be involved in holding their decision makers, policy makers, accountable for achieving this work? That's at the global level. If I go down to some of the regions of the world, in the Arab states, last year with the support of the government of Kuwait, we had 60 youth representatives from 11 Arab states participating in a regional workshop where they were trying to come up with creative ways of making a sustainable development impact in their communities, including those communities affected by conflict, forced displacement, and migration. There's a new report, what we call UNDP does human development reports, and there's a new human development report for the Arab states region, and it's called Youth and the Prospects for Human Development in a Changing Reality. In Asia Pacific region, UNDP and UN volunteers launched what they're calling 2030 Youth Force Initiative, bringing together young leaders across 10 countries, working on advocacy and priority setting on the SDGs. And if you don't know much about the UN Volunteers Program, I'm more than happy to tell you more about that later. It's really one of the most interesting parts of the UN. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we convened a regional workshop in Mexico. Again, 140 representatives from youth organizations from 22 countries came together to discuss youth policies and initiatives that can reduce inequalities and advance sustainable development. In Africa, we have a very successful initiative in Rwanda that supports youth entrepreneurship, called Youth Connect, and we're going to try and scale that up to other countries in the African region. In Europe and Central Asia, because this really is a universal agenda, we're working to boost civic engagement, challenge the gender stereotypes that we still find, and address issues about corruption and transparent governance. In Asia and Pacific region, you may know that it's more than half of the young people in the world today live in this region. And it's also a region that has what we call the demographic dividend. That means there's more working age people and less dependents, dependents being either very children or older people who are no longer working. When you have that type of population structure, you have what we call the demographic dividend. You have more working people, and you can accelerate economic growth, and you don't have so many burdens of social care, be it for very young people or for older people. Now, it doesn't last forever, so these countries are also changing. I mean, all countries of the world, apart from Africa, the youth population, as you've been told, is the largest youth population ever seen by the world, but it's also declining as a proportion of the overall population. It's not yet declining in Africa. It's still climbing, but it will decline. It's just going to decline a little bit later than it's already declining. What we've seen in the past from this demographic dividend, the demographic transition, we saw it in Japan in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where Japan had, now you associate Japan with an aging population now probably, but it also went through that demographic transition. And that has equipped it to deal better than we might expect with its currently aging population. And what happens to Japan is going to happen basically to all countries, whereas we'll have more dependents than younger people in the workforce. That also, of course, brings us to the issue of migration, but let's leave that for another topic. In China, again, with the economic success of China, was in 2010, the working age population in China was 74%. So 74% of the total population were of working age. And again, that's what fueled the incredible Chinese economic growth, which also enabled China to lift so many people out of poverty. However, there's still challenges. Almost half of the 71 million unemployed youth globally, almost half, well, it's 33 million, live in Asia Pacific. And interesting enough, young people in this region are about 5 times more likely to be unemployed than adults at the same level of education, which is basically people who would have the same level of education, let's say left secondary school. Somebody in their 40s may be employed with that level of education, but a young person, say at the age of 20, entering the labour force with just secondary school education is way more likely to be unemployed. And this also points to a mismatch between what the education systems are producing and what employers are looking for. So you may have not enough people coming out with degrees in science and technology. You may also not have enough skilled young people, people who perhaps have not chosen a university path, but they haven't had access to vocational training that would equip them for jobs. So this is one of the issues. There's also issues related to political processes and participation. Apparently 83% of young people have never spoken to their public representative. So that person or people who represent you in your parliament, perhaps in local government, most of you have never spoken to them. I would also guess that many people don't know the name of their local representative in parliament or in local government. We also have here particularly a persistent gender divide. So we have less women participating in the labour market. We also have a pay gap. And in South Asia, that means, and the pay gap is throughout the world, by the way, but in South Asia, that pay gap means that women generally make 1/3 less than men. And I think we talk a lot about equal pay. It's not always equal pay for the same job. That's relatively easy or somewhat easy these days. We don't expect 2 teachers in a school to be getting different pay because one is male, one is female. But we still have an issue with what we call equal pay for work of equal value. And unfortunately, women's work is often not given the same value as men. You know, a woman who works in a restaurant kitchen is a cook, not very skilled. A man who works in a restaurant kitchen is a chef, quite a prestigious job. So this is another issue. So we really believe that we have to support young people to have access to more and better jobs, a business climate that supports you in starting and doing business, a financial sector that gives you the financial services tailored to your needs as young people. It's going to be a time of your life when you probably have less assets, but you still need capital injections for your projects. And in times of crisis, better livelihood security. One crisis can wipe away decades and decades of development. I have some other examples of things that we do, but I think maybe I can leave some of that to a Q&A. But I do just want to touch on one area that UNDP also works in, because we do a lot of work in crisis and post-crisis countries. And we see, we see the problem of child soldiers, which is something that our colleagues in UNICEF are very much addressing, the issue of child soldiers. But when we have peace, or after a crisis or political combat, we have, it's true even in my own region of the world, because I'm Irish, after a crisis, you sometimes have a lot of young, and I have to say mostly men, not exclusively, but mostly men, who've been involved in some kind of paramilitary or military activities. They have to be demobilized. What do they do next? What do you do with a lot of young men who have spent the last 5 years fighting, being part of a paramilitary organization, who have usually got access to guns and don't have access to much else, maybe have kind of left their communities, left their families. So we do a lot of work on demobilization. And one interesting example is in Nepal, where we, UNDP and others, were supporting the transition of young ex-combatants back to civilian life. provide them with career counseling, job matching assistance, internships, and trainings on micro enterprise development, and some small grants for those people who feel that they have the ability to start a small enterprise. And this is about, through this, 3,000 young Nepalis have been able to start their own businesses and start to be productive members of their communities. We do similar work in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, among others. I want to go back to my favorite subject, the SDGs. And I would encourage all of you to get fully acquainted with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Please don't ask me to recite them all, because I'm still trying to memorize them all. If you find it overwhelming, as I said, there's 17 goals, 169 targets. If you find that a bit too much to remember, I think there's really only two things you need to remember. The main message of the SDGs is very simple. It's leave no one behind. And that was a message that we learned from the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals, the previous set of 8 goals. When we measured success of the Millennium Development Goals, we measured it by countries. This country has achieved a huge reduction in maternal mortality. This country has increased the number of girls going to primary school. Or this country has not done so well. But we learned that that wasn't enough, because you've got to, as we say, disaggregate. So how are women doing? How are people in the remote areas doing? Maybe you've done a really successful job of getting young girls into school, and you've increased the percentage. But in 5 or 6 remote areas of the country, young girls are not going to school at all. There are communities where no girls go to school. So we've learned that it's not just enough to look at how a country is doing. We need to look at how everybody is doing. Is it applying to people with disabilities? Is it applying equally to different genders? Is it applying to young and old? Is it different geographical areas, indigenous people versus people in the cities? So the leave no one behind is really the key, the secret key to the SDGs. It's really got to be everybody, and we can no longer focus on averages. Now, the second thing to remember, and this is just my personal view, there are 17 goals. We don't rank them, we don't say one is more important than the other. But I do think, and this is again my personal view, that goal 16 is again another key to the success of the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 16, as I'm sure you all know, is the goal about promoting peaceful and inclusive societies. Now, I think that if you don't have peaceful society where people feel safe, and I'm not just talking about conflict, we can also know crime is an issue for many people as well. If you don't feel safe at night, if women don't feel safe to go out, if it's not an inclusive society, if we don't feel that everyone has the same life opportunities, irrespective of their income level, where they were born, who their family is, gender, are they disabled, are they able-bodied, we're not going to achieve anything else. So I think, as I said, it's my personal view, but if we don't have peace and if we don't involve everyone, this to me are the keys. I would say if you can't remember any other of the goals, try and remember 16. Now I say that particularly because next week is 12th of August is International Youth Day. And this year the theme is Youth Building Peace. Now when we say building peace, for me that's not just about ending conflict or avoiding conflict. One thing we've learned, I think, over the last couple of decades is we have to be proactively involved in building peace. And peace among communities, peace among ourselves, peace among different religions, different ethnicities, different political perspectives. It's really an ongoing, active thing that we have to do to build peace. And that brings me back to political participation. I've touched on it a few times, and I wanted to end by again touching on that issue. I mentioned that 83% of youth apparently have never spoken to or been in contact with their public representative. But let me add a few more facts and figures. The average age of parliamentarians across the world is 53. I think for women it's a little bit, if you look at females, about 50. Now, I'm all for respect for older people, for being an older person, respect for our experience, our wisdom. But I think we need parliaments that are also representative of their populations. And then if we look at, so age profile is one, and remember the UNDP campaign that you're never too young to run. If we look at gender, I think we would all agree it's a very bleak situation, and one that actually hasn't improved hugely over the last decade or so. I think globally the figures are 22% of parliamentarians across the globe are women. Now, that is not representative in any way of our populations. Only 2 countries have achieved gender parity, 50% or more parliamentarians. That's Rwanda and that's Bolivia. So it's not to do about income, it's not necessarily to do about culture, it's really about making a difference, committing to gender equality. And I think this is an area where you all, right now, have the opportunity to make a difference. The obvious thing in political participation is get out and vote. I'm sure most of you do that. Are you then, between elections, holding your local officials accountable? Are they delivering on their campaign promises? Are they doing what you expect of them? They are your representatives. And that applies at national government level, but it also applies local government. Increasingly, local governments, and we've seen this in climate change, for example, have a very powerful and effective role to play. So I'd also encourage you to look at local government. I'd asked all of you also, I think you're here because you're interested in making a difference, you're interested in public service. And I think sometimes we forget that running for political office, national, local level, is also public service. I know politicians many of us are not very impressed with whoever our politicians are. We think they're manipulative, we think they're just interested in their own perspectives. But we should remember that running for public office is probably one of the most important areas of public service. And I think you as young people have a real chance to reinvigorate political participation, really to make a difference. I think the world now needs, I'm not looking at any one country in particular, because every country, I think, there's a disillusionment with politics as it is. But that's how we affect change. We affect change through our democratic institutions and processes. And I'd like you all to, as we come up to 12th of August, International Youth Day, promoting peaceful societies, building peace, to really think of that. I can't think of a group of people sitting here who could be better equipped to make that life choice. I'll leave you with that. I'm joined here on the podium by 2 of my colleagues. I believe we're going to have some questions and answers, and I think I can predict that one of the questions might be about working for the UN. So I persuaded my two colleagues to come and perhaps be able, who have both got different career paths in the UN, to tell them a little bit about their career paths. I can also tell you a little bit about the United Nations volunteer program, if anyone's interested in that. But I'd like to wish you all a very successful week in this, as they call Thailand, the land of smiles and the city of angels. Thank you.